Why do we exist? For centuries, this question was the sole province of religion and philosophy. But now science is ready to take a seat at the table. Hi, I'm Dr. Ted Achacoso, your host for today's podcast. My guest today is Bobby Azarian. Bobby is a science journalist and a cognitive neuroscientist with a PhD from George Mason University. He has written for publications including The Atlantic, The New York Times, BBC, Scientific American, Slate, HuffPost, Quartz, and Aeon. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Human Brain Mapping, Cognition and Emotion, Acta Psychologica, and the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. His blog, Mind in a Machine, hosted by Psychology Today, has received over 8 million views. Azarian worked on season 2 of YouTube premium psychology-based series Mind Field as a consultant and researcher, which helped the show win its first Emmy nomination. He has appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, the Michael Shermer Show, David Pakman Show, and the Young Turks to discuss his work. He is based in Arlington, Virginia. Today, Bobby helps us answer three $64 million questions, or should I say $64,000 questions. First, why is it difficult for conservatives to change their beliefs? Second, what is life, consciousness, self, and attention? And third, what is the unifying theory of reality? Ladies and gentlemen, Bobby Azarian. Hi, I'm Dr. Ted Achacoso, and today we have the great Bobby Azarian. We seem to have a common hobby, um, and the common hobby, the name of it is thanks to Carl Friston. It's called epistemic foraging. We seem to have a hobby of
I
epistemic
love that
foraging.
term, yes.
When people ask me what's your hobby, it says epistemic foraging. So I foraged something, and I found out something. Actually, you actually um, created quite a ruckus the other day when you were the neuroscientist quoted why explaining why former U.S. president supporters refused to accept his 91 felony cases. And
Yeah, I've been writing those articles for like 7 years, but
yeah,
things died down when Biden got elected, but things are heating up now. And I will say, I'm very critical of the former president, but I'm not happy with the other options either. So
yeah.
yeah, we
So
can talk about that.
what is the neuroscientific explanation? And I know it has something to do with how the brain actually allocates its energy resources. But what is the neuroscientific explanation of why you can't give up a belief?
Yeah, so one study I cited, I actually wrote an article for Daily Beast like 2014 probably. It's becoming more relevant, but it was studies that Sam Harris did for his dissertation work, I think at UCLA.
Yeah.
And basically those studies showed that it's easier to accept beliefs than to reject them as false. If someone's like trying to tell you something is true, the brain has to do more cognitive work. So it takes more resources if you're going to reject an idea as opposed to accepting it. And in the case of Donald Trump, when he's telling these fictions, like he likes to do, but in all fairness, like all politicians
Yeah.
like to do pretty much, their supporters, for one thing, they have confirmation bias. That's at play. But also, it's just, people aren't intuitively skeptical usually. They're just, if it's a person they look up to, they're willing to believe that person. And there's a lot of other factors at play, like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Sometimes these people think they have nothing to learn, so they think everything they know is right, and they don't even go through this cognitive process of challenging yourself. And we should always question our beliefs. I think that's the big thing. And the people on the right and the left, both sides are guilty of not having a process of critical analysis where you take your beliefs and you ask yourself, you know, how certain am I that this is true? And if you're 100% certain, you've already made a mistake, because every model has uncertainty. Every scientific theory, for example, has been proven inaccurate in some way, because we're always just learning more about the world. We have to do epistemic foraging. We have to collect knowledge. We have to be curious. And if we have that approach, we will find out that oftentimes we were a little bit wrong about something. Even if we were right in some sense, there's usually some aspect of something where we are wrong and we have something to learn. And then we need to update our model of the world, our theoretical model of the world. So our system of beliefs, our worldview, in the face of new evidence. We have to, take into account reality and then adjust our beliefs accordingly. And neither side wants to do that.
Bayesian inference, right?
That's what it is. It's applying Bayesian inference and reasoning to everyday life. And you can do that. You don't have to use Bayes' theorem. You don't need to have a mathematical formula. You just need to ask yourself, what are the competing theories? Like, what are all the possible explanations for this event? And then try to weigh them maybe according to some probability rating, and then devise a test or something you would expect to see if those beliefs are true. And then after that test is done, then you correct those weightings in light of the new evidence. And it's just
did you also see that study? It was another study done on Fox News viewers made to watch CNN for a couple of weeks, I think, and then CNN viewers, made to watch Fox News for a couple of weeks, and then it was a study that came out probably 3 or 4 years ago, where they showed that whereas the Fox News people were actually, when they watched CNN, were able to question and change their beliefs. Though the people from CNN, they watch Fox News, did not change their beliefs whatsoever. It was very interesting.
And it doesn't surprise me. And I always have a lot of people, and they say, what about the other side? And I say, that's a fair question. But when I write an article, it's taking a position, and it would ruin the whole thing for every article if you just analyze the other side. But in other articles, I try to do that. But yeah, everybody's right. Like when you read an article and I'm making a point about Trump, it usually does apply to the other side. But I have come out with an article about Joe Biden's cognitive decline and why he might not be a great candidate. So I do try to be fair.
I read a paper a while back on, I'm a neural network guy, basically, whose career was killed by Minsky, but
because I have some beef with some of the things Minsky said about emergence being magic and stuff. But he was a brilliant guy.
Minsky,
no doubt.
Unfortunately, was the one who reviewed my book, and kabam, there went my faculty stats and everything else. Yeah, because he was an expert systems guy. He did not think that neural networks are going to amount to anything, and my work was the first complete connectome for a biological organism, and then doing math on it, and
I'm sure you'll be recognized. I'm sure that will be corrected. Yeah.
If the god from MIT could, makes his pronouncement, you're dead. And then 25 years later, the researchers are calling me up and asking for a copy of my book. And I said, why? What's the matter? Right? Yeah, I created the first complete connectome. I said, oh, there's an ohm for it now. There's a name for it now. There's an ohm, right?
I was listening to that Carl Friston interview.
I read this paper.
By those stories,
I read this paper that said, well, the neural network of belief and how we become conservative, liberal as we get older in terms of in terms of what happens. And the way I actually visualize it in my brain is that imagine the outline of a folder, right? Of an envelope, rather, an outline of an envelope. that you have to seal and send. So when you're growing up, that's closed, right, and hard and closed. And then with education, you're sent to school, etc. Then the envelope opens, right? It opens and it widens the network for you. And then as you get older and get more educated, then it actually gets this secondary harmonic recurrence and so on and so forth. And I thought that was a very good model for how education actually um, moves us from Cosa Nostra, just our stuff, right, into I have a responsibility not only to myself, my family, but to my community. And then you get to college and shit, I have responsibility to my society and to my country. And then if you take a psychedelic, especially, then you have a responsibility towards the world and the cosmos at large, right?
Yes.
So, so,
That's
and
where
that
I am. Yeah.
yeah, and it's so much fun to see the rebus model of Robin Carhart Harris, for example, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, right? When he wrote that paper, it's just like this is exactly what it does. It loosens, all of those things that are very tightly connected in there, even just for a bit, enough for you to carry something back when you're off your journey, right?
I love that you bring that up because that's super important. So that whole belief thing that I was just talking about, questioning your beliefs, it doesn't really come easy if you have a rigid brain. So if you basically don't have well formed executive control,
Yeah.
you will have a harder time doing that exercise. So for some people, psychedelics like mushrooms or some sort of meditative process that similarly
Mm,
dissolves the ego and brings you to that critical point that you're talking about, um, that may be necessary for dissolving inaccurate belief structures quickly.
have you
So
taken psychedelics?
well, growing up, just being a guy that is part of the music scene and stuff, like the art scene, like I had friends who would, do mushrooms, and I
Mm,
did it like 3 times, but small amounts. So I never did it enough to really have like a full
mm,
blown experience. But one time I was in the woods, and there were all these lightning bugs, fireflies, like
mm-hmm.
everywhere. Must have been like mating season. Like they were like thousands of them lighting up this strange. It was like this in the middle of the forest. There was just this big circular field. It looked like a place like a UFO would land or something. And so that was a very beautiful experience that I shared with some people. And but I guess what I've experienced is just certain flow states, especially
Mm-hmm.
now that like for 10 years I don't drink at all. I don't
Mm-hmm.
touch caffeine. I don't even eat chocolate because there's trace amounts of caffeine, like no stimulants or anything. So I'm very healthy in a sense. Well, yeah, I'm very healthy. I won't say in a sense. I do take like edibles sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
cannabis edibles, and try to achieve flow states. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, those states are psychedelic, and I listen to music. I watch films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, movies like that to kind of cultivate a psychedelic mental state. And that's what fuels my writing mostly. And, gives
you
me
know,
these cosmic goals that you talked about. That reminds me of like Michael Levin's like cognitive light cones, because that corresponds to like the
yeah,
agent's goals.
yeah.
And so as I wrap my head around more of the meta system that I'm a part of, like the whole global human network, and in some sense the cosmos more, um, more globally or universally, I do feel like my goal is no longer a personal goal. It's to kind of help facilitate life's long-term persistence.
In fact, you said something about the fireflies, and each time someone says something like that, that's the awe, right? That you experience that is beyond you, and yet you feel one with it. My experience there was the opposite of a field of fireflies. Rather, while walking on my evening walk, I walk about 5 miles every day, and the it's firefly mating season, and then a firefly just landed on my wrist.
You also had a firefly experience. Wow.
Yeah, it just landed on my wrist, and it was feeling the feet and everything else, and just watching it. It was just like
And
I
it was your
wasn't
buddy,
there.
right?
Wasn't there. It's like I was just like one with everything else, and this firefly was just me also, right?
And I
Um,
feel like, you became, one with nature, but I also think that the firefly probably was looking for a kind of social connection. Like it knew you weren't a rock, probably. It knew that you were a living agent, I bet. So I bet it was vibing with you.
Yeah, mosquitoes know I'm a living agent because I happen to secrete the right pheromones for it to just bite me all the time.
Well, I noticed that. I don't know if it has to do with darker complected people, but my wife is from Mexico and she's half Mayan, and they love her blood. Like
Yeah,
they will just
well,
go right past me, and like all 10 will just attack her.
it's just interesting how the various things that we don't see really affect us, and they provide context to the experience, right? And one of your articles in was it June in Big Think was the universe may be one giant neural network. Can can
Yes.
can
So
you
yeah,
can you
I'm
explain that a
interested to
little
see what
bit
you
with
think
us?
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, because my question there is that if it's one giant neural context, a neural network, then what gives it context, right?
Well, yeah. So I think thinking about context is always important. I guess I'm not fully clear on what you're asking because I'm not even fully clear on what the neural network paradigm is saying. I did write that article and I have been meeting with the scientists who put forth that theory. Like we had all of these group meetings and we discussed all of these topics. But really, what I found out about it is it was the same theory that's in my book. It's a theory of hierarchical emergence. So there is a neural network at the bottom level, but Vitaly Van Chern says it's not well defined. So I was like, what are the nodes? Are the nodes like at the Planck scale? And he's like, well, they're kind of like strings. You can't ask what are nodes. So there's no clarity on what the actual neural network is like fundamentally composed of. That doesn't seem to be the right way of thinking about it. It seems like he's saying that the neural network is sort of emergent, and that these levels, like when physics organizes into biology and then into social systems, that's like the nodes, like like clusters forming, like computational clusters, or at least that's how I was describing it to him, and he
Wouldn't
seemed to be
it be
fine with
something
that.
more
So
like, the way I was seeing when I was reading that article, it's like there's this network that's somehow fractalized and it's just scaled up, right? And it's just
yes,
forming up this network in a larger and larger scale, and that's
exactly.
how
It's
I
like a
more visualize
fractal.
it, right?
Yes, it's just the process. So really, you can focus on calling it that, but to me, what the theory is, it's a process of recursive self-organization or hierarchical emergence. So just reality is creative, and it's maybe this network, but yeah, the network is just like forming, like the nodes are like forming these groups or clusters, and those are self-organizing systems, and then those systems make copies of themselves and form other clusters. So it's really this fractal, self-similar structure of complex adaptive systems just arising. And so I think that's what the universe is. It's more like an oak seed developing into an oak tree, but much more extravagant. But it's this cosmic mind that starts out like the kind of seed of that is life, although the process goes all the way back to the Big Bang. If the Big Bang is the beginning for this universe, I know people are calling the Big Bang theory into question now. But yeah, the idea is just that we're completely thinking about the universe in the wrong way. All of the famous physicists like Brian Greene are thinking about it in the wrong way. It's not this static thing that reductionist theories explain, like in terms of fundamental particles, and then that's all we care about. It seems to be this creative universe. People have described it as one of becoming rather than being. So it's one that's constantly evolving, and you see these emergences. So you see these forms forming, you see agents with goals and purposes forming, and then making copies of themselves and making like, networks. So it seems that the human population has formed a network that's itself an intelligent organism, or maybe you can call it a brain, and the whole biosphere, all the ecosystems interconnected, would be the body of the organism or superorganism, and that we form something like a brain on top of it. So while this sees life as being important and humans as being important, you have to remember that everything's connected. Everything's part of one system. So there's no superior or inferior. It's kind of like everything's part of your body. And when you realize that, then like harming other people or other organisms, of course, we can't help but harm some of them, right now at least. But you see everything as part of you. Doesn't mean that you're going to be nice to everybody, because you also have to enforce fairness. Like, we have to do things to enforce fairness. We can't be forgiving. Like, everybody can't just not beep at someone who's cutting people off. Like, oh, let's forgive them. Let's be nice. Let's, have forgiveness in our heart. Like, you have to sometimes honk that horn, because it's a signal to someone that they need to change their behavior to be more synchronistic with the whole. And if you don't do that, you're in some ways doing a disservice to everyone, because you're not enforcing that global coherence. And actually, terror management theory shows with these dictator games that like people will lose money. So take a personal loss to enforce fairness, to punish someone for violating certain norms. Sometimes that's bad. That leads to groupthink and tribalism. But so we need to sort of break tribalism, but we also need to do the same thing. We need to show people are behaving in a suboptimal way. They're not being Bayes optimal with how they reason and stuff, and that's kind of built into how government operates. And I think it's time for the scientists and philosophers and people who just think this stuff is cool to like have a voice and start being like, politics. Like, the system just has to change.
Well, you reminded me of a paper that I presented, and you provided a good segue to my next question. One is I wrote a paper and presented it at a symposium in 1990, which was scaling up the nervous system of K. Neuroditis elegans. Is 1/8
That's
equal
so
to
cool that you
33
did that.
million worms, right?
Yeah.
And that's where
Wait, what was it? What was the
huh?
figure?
No. Is scaling up the nervous system of C. elegans. Uh, is 1/8 equal to 33 million worms.
33 million worms. Okay.
Yes, and because when I entered the lab of Dr. Yamamoto, the guy who started the whole medical informatics field, he said, "Well, is consciousness computable?" I said, "Yes." "Is beauty computable?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "In this lab, you only get to answer one question."
Yeah.
I should have chosen beauty and gotten funding. At that time in 1988, no one was funding consciousness studies, right? And
No.
and I said, "What are you doing for research?" I said, "I'm doing computational neurobiology." And it's like, "What's that?" And so even before the field computational neurobiology was formalized, we were doing that. Um,
That's
and,
very cool.
and it's just like, plus, considering that your first book is, is basically just said, this is nothing. So it was really a difficult road forward at the time. Christoph Koch and all these other people were younger than I was. They were younger
Well,
than I
Crick
was.
wasn't,
Yeah, yeah. But, Crick wasn't, and I think he was still alive at the time, right?
and probably Edelman, people like
Yeah,
him.
Gerald Edelman's neuroDarwinism was a source of his primary consciousness and secondary consciousness. I loved that stuff. Bright air,
Yeah,
brilliant
me
fire.
too. I hope it comes back. I heard from someone that Carl Friston doesn't like talking about neuroDarwinism, so he's
No,
like he's
I
suppressing
love the
it.
fact. I love the fact that he was
I
able
love
to
Carl,
say,
so
well,
yeah,
okay, it's a dog, he has a primary consciousness, right? And you're human, here you have your primary consciousness, and your secondary consciousness. And it's when I read Kahneman, it's like the remembered self, right? And experiencing self, and it is just
yes.
like
I
it's
think it
just like the
maps on
same
to the one
thing.
and two. Yeah, it maps on to
Yeah.
the fast and slow. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, you alluded to terror management theory, and actually you wrote about this a little bit. And there was an older article on how fear of death uh, makes people more right wing. And can you tell us about the hot sauce experiment?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And so I will say that it doesn't always make people more right wing. It tends to, but sometimes it can make left wing people more extreme towards the left. So it really just depends. But with that article, I was kind of writing about it in the context of Trump just announced he was running for president, and a lot of people thought that was a joke, but I could see that there was a movement brewing and that he was really resonating. And to me, the main thing that I saw, because what I had been covering before that was ISIS, all of the ISIS attacks. Um, and so I saw that there was existential fear created by the ISIS attacks because, we can't really remember how we felt now. But back then, it was super scary because we didn't know if we were going to go to the mall and there was going to be some bomb or something. We didn't know. And there was a lot of those attacks happening. And of course, after 9/11, that was a while back, but people were reminded of that. And then anybody in any sort of big building, like, everybody was scared. And so I think that was kind of the main thing that created, that allowed for this Donald Trump kind of nationalist movement. And Donald Trump, it wasn't just that. Donald Trump was, running on an anti-establishment message, and that's why he's going to do really well again, because people are sick of like the status quo. And Bernie Sanders was speaking to that too, and he was super popular, and the Democrats did what they had to do to defeat him, which was pretty unfair if you look at how they did it. But yeah, so then you asked the question about the hot sauce study. So the hot sauce study, yeah, that was pretty entertaining. Basically, terror management theory shows that if someone is perceived as a threat to you, but it doesn't have to be a physical threat. It can be just a threat to your worldview. So the person could just say disparaging comments about, Joe Biden or Donald Trump or conservatives or liberals. Like, all they have to do is like threaten your worldview. And that's what the study showed. It had people making those kind of disparaging comments about your ideology. And then they were asked, those people who had those comments made about them, how much hot sauce they would allocate to that person. That person would have to eat like a little bit or a lot of very hot sauce. Probably not too hot because of ethical issues, IRBs and stuff. But yeah, they had found that people who disparaged their political views were given more hot sauce. So we try to hurt people. We try to physically harm people who threaten our worldview. Really, what it shows is anytime there's a worldview threat, so especially when there's we're fearful for whatever reason, the pandemic, if there's a context of fear or threat that's lingering,
Right.
then we will be way more sensitive to these worldview threats. So if someone says, I don't like, or just a Black Lives Matter sticker, could be, if you're, not a liberal, that sticker could be enough to trigger you if someone cuts you off or almost doesn't even cut you, just a little bit, and, doesn't show their blinker, and they have a sticker. It could be MAGA if you're left wing. It could be, something like, BLM if you're right wing. And if there's a threatening context, if you're
Yeah.
if it's polarized times, you will be more likely to lose your temper and potentially do something. And so this theory, terror management theory, and I've tried to apply it more broadly to like evolution and
Yes.
take into account consciousness, and that's going to be in my next book that I'm working on. you will see human behaviors pretty easy to understand in a lot of ways. You will see this flip get switched where people go from the automatic, the reflexive mind to the automatic mind, and then they're just more readily lose their temper, for example.
Well, I wonder, as I'm as a hormone guy, I wonder if we just sprayed them with oxytocin first, and then see whether or not they will still apply the same amount of hot sauce, right? But the oxytocin studies are more for cheating. That's the studies that they did were more for cheating or giving you the amount of investments or in their game playing where there's equality, right?
I
But I
think it would
wonder
have
whether or
the
not
same
it will.
effects, because that's essentially what I'm trying to show, that there's this switch that gets flipped. Basically, there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, the resting state and the
Yeah,
fight or flight state, and that
yeah,
those correspond to basically Kahneman's system 1 and 2, like fast and
yeah,
slow, or
yeah.
automatic and reflective, or kind of like subconscious and conscious. And basically that flip gets switched by worldview threats. So if something triggers triggers you because it's threatened your worldview, you will go from the resting state to an anxious threatening state, and your behavior will change. You'll see a behavioral change, and you won't
Mhm.
be acting with your reflexive mind. You'll be more just like your programmed sort of behavior, and you won't regulate yourself. You might say something that if someone was filming it,
Mhm.
you might be embarrassed about how you behaved because you're not engaging your reflexive mind. So one thing is people have to cultivate this sort of executive control muscle, this effortful control or cognitive control kind of meta mind. And that's what's going to save us. Like that, like if everyone cultivates that meta mind, we can stop our instincts when we start to behave in a way that's not in line with our long-term goals, I would say.
I actually have um, a joke. It's actually not much of a joke, but it's funny. Which is my advice to men. If you find yourself getting extremely angry, you get an erection because erection is parasympathetic. So,
Oh my God, that's
so,
awesome. That's
so,
hilarious.
ejaculation is sympathetic, but erection, that's parasympathetic. Just go get an erection, you'll be fine.
Yeah,
So
so if you have road rage, there's a show Beef. I don't know if you've seen Beef. It is the best show ever. It's about
oh
all this.
yes, 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 yes.
And
I
they actually,
began
the
it.
end, there's a psychedelic moment, there's a learning moment at the end that's perfectly in line with everything we've said. But yeah, so if you have road rage, maybe pull over on the side of the road and handle it yourself, and calm down that way.
Well,
That's great.
others recommend breathing, but that's not no fun. It's so much more fun to be
If you're out in
parasympathetically
public,
stimulated.
you might want to breathe instead. It's probably a good alternative, but that's
That
what gets
depends on
me
how
through.
loose your pants are. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, you actually gave me another segue. You talked about Beef. That's out of Netflix, right? There
Yeah.
is also Foundation, which is nice because Apple now finally
Is that
put in
Isaac
a series
Asimov?
on Asimov, right? And I
Yeah.
read that trilogy. And in one of your lectures, see, I studied you, Bobby. In one of
That
your
I'm so honored that the guy that made the first connectome, even though it wasn't called that, the C. elegans neural circuitry database.
database, yeah, yeah.
See, it does have a good ring to it. I remembered it. But yeah, 3 words is better than one. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
But
I haven't read that book, so I did. I'm kind of a poser, but yeah, I do mention that a lot.
no, because you mentioned Cleodynamics, right?
Peter Turchin's,
And
yeah, or social
Cleodynamics, and
statistical
I said
mechanics, yeah.
when you were yeah when you were saying Cleodynamics, I said that sounds like psychohistory of the fiction of Asimov,
Yes.
and in the Foundation series, they actually put it out there. Psychohistory, it's like a statistical form of the individual. The individual, you cannot predict the behavior of each individual, but you could predict the behavior of populations, right? And
Yeah, mass behavior.
although
Yeah, Howard Bloom's very
yeah,
interested
yeah.
in this too.
So
Yeah.
so can you explain a little bit what Cleodynamics did in predicting this chaotic this chaotic era that we have?
Yeah, I don't know much about it. I can tell you a little bit about it, but I can tell you more about what I think we can predict, like new ways to
Oh,
do
sure.
social statistical mechanics that could be part of Cleodynamics, but maybe goes beyond. So I did mention that because Peter Turchin, who I haven't talked to really, I had some exchanges on Facebook, but yeah, I didn't know that his dad was Valentin Turchin, and that he's a big figure in my book. He's a cyberneticist. He was doing work in the 70s and 80s. Like he wrote this amazing book. I think it was like 1969 or something that it got published, and it actually had neural networks. Like they weren't called neural networks, but there were these, you know, hierarchical models. And yeah, if you read the book, it's called The Phenomenon of Science. It's kind of a play on words on Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man, which is also a great book that influenced my book. But this one basically takes that idea of this global consciousness emerging in noosphere, and then more largely life spreading throughout the cosmos and potentially forming like a cosmic mind. But it was all based on like a cybernetics model. So it was very mathematical. And yeah, it's a great book, but it was going to be released in Russia. And he wrote, I think, Russia's first like programming language he invented. But this went kind of against with the government, like the government's ideology, and he actually had to flee to the U.S. And then like he went to Princeton, I think, and they released it, but like no one here knew who he was really. So yeah, it's free online. But anyway, basically, you know, Turchin's model and the model in my book, like this idea of, you know, kind of meta systems emerging, systems coming together to make larger systems in this cosmic evolutionary process, that creates a sort of predictability to life's progress and human progress, because it says we're forming these collectives and that we're forming something like a global brain, and that creates something like a global mind. So that right there gives you some predictive power, because you're like, okay, we're forming these networks, and these networks are similar to the same kind of complex adaptive systems at lower levels. So a society will be similar to an organism in its dynamics, or a brain. And so his son, Peter Turchin, looks at these historical patterns, and Cleodynamics is his name for this study of historical patterns. So I'm not sure how much he uses like complex system science, or if he's just really looking at patterns, because you can look at the historical patterns, but what's different about what I'm proposing is those historical patterns, you might be able to, you know, predict certain things the way they're trying to predict the stock market. But if you take the whole theory into account, then there's events like the emergence of a global mind, which aren't in the history in the same way. So I'm saying that we could use this to predict stock market, like crypto prices. Everything is somehow mapped onto this hierarchical self-organization process. And so there's a lot of things, you know, there's a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty with life. Like Stuart Kaufman has pointed out that the evolution of the biosphere is not perfectly predictable. And he talks about these, you know, the adjacent possible, like life
Yes.
is just, but what I'm saying,
I'm a lifelong Kaufman fan, man.
I love Kaufman, but I think he's making too big of a deal. He's trying to prove that biology, that, you know, you can have free will and agency because it's not predictable. And I think that's great. But at the same time, this expansion of life into the adjacent possible, there is like a series of attractors that can be, you know, understood and outlined. And so that there is this amount of predictability, which is good. It says, you know, the future is not set in stone, but we can kind of see where we're going, and we can course correct when we're getting off track. So I think we can do things like, for example, let's say I want to predict you, Ted, your behavior, or like how you're going to vote. What I would try to do is I would look at all of the people that you're connected through on social media. Let's say I look at your Instagram,
Right.
and then I see the people that you follow and interact with most. And then I weight the people that you interact with. I create like a network for like you, and I make you like Ted is like a community of minds. So I model you as a network of agents, and those are the people that you follow. And then if I know how they will respond to a certain event, if I know their political leanings, then with some statistical certainty, I will be able to predict what you are likely to do based on who you follow. It's not
Yeah.
perfect, but
Well,
I
well,
think that
isn't that like close to the saying, "Tell me who your five closest friends are, and I'll tell you who you are." Kind of,
yep.
right? Right.
Yep, just doing it more thoroughly and looking at who you interact with most and who you follow in politics and stuff. And I imagine there's lots of ways to model agents that you know we would try to make a system of beliefs for you, and then we would try to understand by your belief system. We would try to predict how you'll respond to certain things. By having a causal model of you. So there's a lot of different things, but what I'm saying is Bayesian brain hypothesis, the active inference framework. I think this can be used
Mm-hmm.
to predict collective behavior, but also individual behavior, because we do follow these attractant sets. Like we have these
Right.
routines. And
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that we are, like, at a subconscious level, it's not just one subconscious mind, that it's a community of minds. There's thinking through other minds. This is a theory by Friston and Ramstead. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's internal family systems, which is clinical psychology. It kind of says that, imagine you're a kid and you have a good life and you're this certain personality, and you then have some traumatic thing where you have to become someone else. And internal family system says you kind of accumulate those different personalities throughout life, and then you kind of have all of those. And when you have to deal with a certain thing, that agent will kind of become the conscious agent. So I do think there's good reason to believe that we are networks of minds. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
could have a dream tonight where you're in it, Ted, and then Levin and Friston and some of my academic heroes, and
Mm-hmm.
they can all be telling jokes that's accurate to their personality. And it's like, how can I that happen in my dream? It's, oh, I have a coarse grained model of you in my mind
Mm-hmm.
that has enough knowledge encoded that lets me know, like, your personality, and I'm making predictions. And so I think we need to start thinking about our minds as models of the world that have all of these other agents. Um, and who knows, maybe those agents can give us certain powers. Like Ramanujan, the mathematician, said his goddess Namagiri was giving him answers. Like, I had a dream where Bjork was performing a song that was more elaborate and like amazing than any song I've ever heard. It was in my dream as being made by my brain. How did my brain create a Bjork song that was like the best song I've ever heard? I'm a musician, so maybe that explains it. But the model of Bjork in my dream was way more talented than me in my conscious waking state.
Well, that's also added to that is psychedelic induced psychoplastogenesis, right? Neural connections
Well, I
and
never heard that term. What's that term?
psychoplastogens. Yeah,
Psychoplastogenesis.
and
Wow.
there's a term called psychoplastogenesis, right? Because the term neuroplasticity is very limiting, right?
Okay.
So they have neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, but there are psychoplastogens where on the collective, it includes neurogenesis, it includes just the modification of connections like ketamine dust, like within 6 hours you grow new dendrites and so on. This is, I have a special interest as a pharmacologist in psychotropic agents, both natural and synthetic. And, I think the better overarching term rather than psychedelics that makes it more acceptable or palatable to the public who basically have an aversion towards the term psychedelic because of its history would be a psychoplastogen, right?
Okay,
So
I
it
like
makes it,
that. Yeah, I'm gonna have to
yeah.
interview you on my channel, because on my channel, Road to Omega, I'll have you and a few other psychedelics experts come on, because I
Oh, be
love this
happy
stuff
to.
too. I
I'd
absolutely
be
love
happy
it,
to.
and it would be a bigger focus for me if I wasn't so focused on the other stuff. But at some point, you know, I,
Yeah.
I've always been really interested in. I actually booked Robin Carhart Harris for a Minefield episode with Vsauce. There was a YouTube
Mm-hmm.
premium series that got an Emmy nomination the year I worked for it. But I sent Michael Stevens Vsauce to Peru to do
Mm-hmm.
ayahuasca, And then I got the neuroscientist Robin Carhart Harris to like do all of these different, neural and psychological tests, and it's online somewhere. It has
Fantastic.
like 10 million views or something. Yeah.
Well, when I was 50, as a pharmacologist, I took the classic ayahuasca, and I said, this is awful because of all the, I was vomiting terribly, as it's so
I
hard
hear
to
you
bring anything
vomiting.
back.
Yeah,
And
it's coming
so
out both ends.
I
Yeah.
developed a protocol called pharmahuasca, and that's what I'm
Pharmahuasca.
known for now. My friends call it achahuasca after my last name. But yeah, I developed a protocol for it so you could be introduced gently into the methyltryptamine effects and so on in a
Wow.
country, not the United States, of course. Um,
Yeah.
but
Well, maybe
yes,
soon.
it took me a couple of years to perfect the protocol, but we have it down in terms of having a clean experience. You know how many milligrams of DMT is coming in. You know how and the journey is about 6 to 8 hours, depending. So it approximates it. But as a physician, I actually, and a pharmacologist, I want to know what dose is coming in, how much the liver is inhibited, and so on. So yeah, it's fun, Bobby, to deal with all of this, and looking at, for example, the models of consciousness, where one model that actually made a significant dent on how I thought about oscillating neural nets, right, was the paper on it oscillates between the DAT, the dorsal attention network, right, and the default mode network, and there's an oscillation. And that actually pushed me to study exactly how do I actually balance those two networks together such that you could experience everyday enlightenment the way the Zen people describe it, right? Just totally
Yes.
present and aware. And I have had several iterations of those, but this is only for like you know uh, uh, private friends and family, and
Wow.
nearby
So
neighbors
exciting.
like those
Yeah.
from George Mason University, I think.
Well,
But
yeah, maybe, yeah. Okay, so I just remembered yeah, I'm gonna be in DC today. Someday,
Great.
some week, we need to try this stuff out. Maybe give me a few months so I make sure I'm like mentally resilient. But because of you
No,
things up here, I've
no,
been
we'll give you what I call the ETs, the Enlightenment Trophies, to make you mentally resilient. How's that?
yes.
So-
And then
but
give me the
but
powerful stuff after that. Yeah. No,
yes,
I'm really
yes.
mentally resilient. I guess this is what I mean. I am operating at that sort of critical state, like at that sort of flow state. Like right now, I'm doing podcasts like pretty much every day. So it's just like I feel like like anything that disturbs that balance can potentially like send me out of it. Like I don't want to lose it, and I don't want to go too psychedelic because I'm like
Yeah.
very practical right now. So I kind of want to plan it. So I'm writing my book, and I feel like once the draft is written, I'm going to need like a kind of psychedelic experience to look at it and be like, now what do I do? Do I create it? Do I make a puzzle or something like
Well, happy to be to facilitate in whatever way I can.
to be
Um,
my neuro shaman?
yeah, neuro shaman. That's funny. When it was still dial-ups, and you had needed to have a handle, and my handle in 1988 was Space Age Shaman.
That's awesome.
Anyway, you actually touched on the next part of what I wanted to discuss with you, which is definitions, for which there are no set definitions, right? And the
Yeah.
first one, I had the opportunity to review Schrodinger's series of lectures on what is life
Yeah, they're
just
great.
recently, and just imagine, when I was reading it when I was 28, it was just like it made me like, well, okay, I taught statistics for like 20 years, and it's like, okay, I kind of understand it, but now with all the developments, so with your book and so on, it's like, well, let me see how Bobby actually defines life, right? My old definitions of life came from Maturana and Varela, that it
Yeah,
is a
they're
physically
great.
closed system that's energetically open, it's autopoietic, and then the deep ecology definitions of Fritjof Capra, just putting them all together, and then getting confused by Star Trek shows that shows this amorphous blob, right? That is alive. So Bobby, what is life for you? Is it like you go from something that's inanimate to animate to something that's alive in an instant, like a bifurcation point, or is it a spectrum? Like for viruses, I'm an undergrad in biology, and we call them as not alive, right? So, what is, according to your definition, your worldview, what is life?
Yeah, there are some physicists who study life, so kind of in the vein of Schrodinger, and they have some similar versions because they kind of influence each other. So the people who influenced me were at George Mason. It was basically Harold Morowitz and
Hmm.
Eric Smith, and they were external Santa Fe Institute kind of stars, not just people. They were like stars. And Eric Smith, Harold passed away. He was like 80, 86 or something, but Eric is still doing origin of life research work right now, and he's I think he might be at Georgia State now. He was at the Tokyo Life Institute for a long time after Mason, and still gives talks at Santa Fe. But so yeah, the definition, it's kind of all of those things that you mentioned. Um, so I think life, living things are agents. They have goals. Um, so inanimate things don't have goals. So rocks don't have goals. They don't move on their own either. They're just there unless external force acts on them. So you can calculate their path and their behavior. You can predict it using Newton's equations. You can't do that with living agents. It doesn't work at all. You can't predict that I'm still and then I decide to jump. So there's no way you can predict that with like Newton's equations. Um, However, you can't predict chaotic systems like dissipative, simple non-biological dissipative systems like whirlpools or hurricanes, tornadoes. Those kind of cyclical energy cycling structures, some people might want to start say, well, those are life. I don't think so. I think life needs it needs to have information, predictive information, and those like hurricanes, they're chaotic. You can't predict that with Newton's equations
Hmm.
either because of like butterfly effect and just chaotic dynamics. But there's no rhyme or reason in where they go. They're not going to go somewhere like they're not going to see that they're running out of energy and then change the path to go find more energy gradients. They don't have that capacity. So,
Is the Earth alive?
well, yeah, so I'm getting there. So with biology, you have a bunch of different molecules that allow, you get the same thing as a self-organizing system like a tornado, but you have more chemical variety. So then you get a more complex structure, like something that's starting to look like a biological structure. There are these, jumps where it becomes more organized through these non-equilibrium phase transitions. So there are these bifurcation points, but I don't think there's one that clearly makes it life. So it is kind of a continuum or
Spectrum?
like yeah, it is a spectrum of like these phases. But at some point, when life starts to be able to replicate itself and stuff, you also start to see this goal-oriented behavior where it starts seeking out energy to maintain its ordered state. So I think when you
Hmm.
start getting, genetic material, that's not what does this energy seeking thing. That's what allows for self replication. But it kind of happens around the same time. But yeah, you get an autopoietic. So the thing is, like, does it have to make copies of itself to be considered life? Because that's when it can do like standard Darwinian
Yeah.
evolution. But if it's just autopoietic and self maintaining, maybe that's enough to call it life. So what Eric Smith says about a virus, he
Hmm.
says it's kind of a meaningless question to say, is the virus like Sarah Walker, like who's influenced by him and Morowitz heavily, um, she would say that the virus is part of life, and AI even is life, but it's not alive. She makes that distinction. Like an organism is alive, but the virus is maybe not alive, but it's life. But sorry,
Well,
one last
that's
thing. One
sorry,
thing to
sorry.
say. So Eric Smith says anything that participates in the whole biosphere
Yeah.
is part of life. So in
Mhm.
that aspect, although a virus doesn't have its own genetic material, it needs a host to replicate and do stuff. It would be part of the network of life, and then the
Mm.
whole Earth would would
I,
probably
I see.
be part of life as well.
Well, it isn't like must. One of the things that actually has fascinated me about this is that does we are just defining life, and for me, it's like, well, are we just referring to life as biological life? Are there other forms of life other than biological life? And that's a question that I've never answered, right?
Yeah,
Because all the life that I know is biological
yeah,
life.
I don't think so. So there was a name. So Morowitz thought this as well, and I think they were called like carbon something where you had like a bias for like carbon based life. But no, I think there's a design. I think there's a certain way that things work in our universe. And I'm not, in a different universe with different laws. Who knows? But I think all naturally arising life will be biological. And I also think it will be hierarchical. So you have a biosphere with like single-celled organisms that eventually form multicellular organisms that form, and maybe even something similar to humans. And Richard Dawkins has actually said this. Michael Shermer, when we had a conversation, he even said that Dawkins had convinced him because of convergent evolution. You can look into Simon Conway Morse if people haven't heard that term, but when you have similar selection pressures, you will get the convergence towards similar
Hmm.
organismic forms, morphologies.
Right.
And so if there's a planet out there and, I think it has to be pushed far from equilibrium. Like it has to be receiving energy in the similar way as our Earth to if it doesn't have that much energy, it might not be able to make like multicellular life. You might just have a planet with like single celled life. But if it's getting all of that energy from a sun and it has all of the same geological factors that we had on Earth when life emerged, I think you would probably get a very similar biosphere and a very similar trajectory towards eventually higher intelligence.
Mm. Well, the so that amorphous blob that's feeding on your the energy of your anger in Star Trek isn't alive then, right?
I
So
don't think that or the Fred Hoyle had one as well. It was like in like the plasma or something, but like no, I don't think those exotic forms of life exist, but maybe we could create them.
yeah, you already alluded to this earlier, and the part that I wanted to in part of our definition is consciousness, right? The what it is to be like something, but from how what's consciousness according to your view. Why is it emergent versus inherent? Is biological life necessary for consciousness to happen, or is it before biological life happens? And what's the difference between consciousness and attention and the notion of the self or agency? So, just distinctions among those. As a cognitive neuroscientist, this is your bailiwick. You can just run through
Yeah,
this,
I'm
I
more
know.
nervous with these questions because they're more specific and like I should have answers given my background. Because my dissertation work was on attention but it was more clinical. It was on how anxiety biases the attentional state. So anxious people will have a bias for threat. If you're anxious, you'll be more likely to focus on threatening aspects of a scene. Um,
Yeah, what can go wrong, right?
yeah, yeah, and it's just it's crazy because if you have it, you don't realize it because you don't know what your attentional focus, you don't know what's biasing it, so you just think you're just looking at it what everybody else looks at. But yeah, you will definitely be focusing on more threat, and then that will lead to rumination. Like that will lead to more threatening trains of thought or anxious trains of thought. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind while we talk about consciousness, because it's very abstract and theoretical. And neuroscientists said for a long time we just weren't supposed to talk about this, consciousness. It was just seemed like,
Well, you talk to me. I'm unfunded, remember?
and that's great. I have a friend who was very passionate about consciousness. He's a brilliant guy. And maybe this has changed recently because of all that AI stuff. But he got a tenure track position, and he was like, I'm not interested in consciousness anymore. It's not like, I prefer to just leave it out of like everything, like all of our discussions about like attention and cognition. And I'm like, no, that's the system. Like that's the everything bad about the system.
Yeah.
Like, and it's terrible because it's like you're becoming part of that. Like you got to that level, and then like you have to become that person now. So
Yeah. You stick
what
your
the
neck out
AI,
and you don't get funded, right?
yeah, I guess, it's so scary. It's like, it is brainwashing because they're like, be this kind of person or we'll take away your funding and we'll call you a kook. But the great thing about ChatGPT is like the world wants to know now, like, are these things conscious? Like, what is consciousness? Like, how do our brains do it? And are these machines capable of doing it? Like, it's probably the most, everybody who does the ChatGPT like wonders, like, is it intelligent?
Yeah.
And
Or
we
as
don't have a
Sam
good theory
Harris,
for that.
says, is the self just another arising in consciousness? So,
Yeah, I'm going against that whole thing that the self is illusory. Big Think came out with an article about Eastern philosophy and saying that, and that science agrees. And now I write for Big Think, so I'm doing the opposite article. Actually, science says that the self is real, because a lot of new science does argue that. People don't know that, and that's going to be released. I think it's a collaboration between Big Think and the Templeton Foundation for The Well. I think it's a blog. It's called The Well or something. But basically, okay. So let's start with consciousness. I don't even think, when you said that, I think it's emergent and not intrinsic, and I'm not sure what you call my stance. So this is what I mean by this. I believe that it emerges, like they're like, probably not even with life, probably with animals, like organisms with brains. And then I think it emerges from self-modeling. And I think before that, like, definitely, like, let's say atoms. I don't think they're conscious. I don't think there's an experience that they're having, a conscious experience with a point of view. I don't think there's any point of view. So that's kind of how neuroscientists started defining consciousness, taken from the philosophers. So it's kind of Thomas Nagel and John Searle, is that, what is it like, mostly Nagel, what is it like to be a bat was a popular essay. But so consciousness means there's a, what is it like? There's an experience, but really that's saying there's an I. It's saying there's a perspective. Someone's having an experience, something. Kind of goes back to Descartes, like, I think, therefore I am. Like, there's actually an experience.
Is that one and the same, consciousness and self, which is the I? Is that one and the same?
Well, people try to say the I is an illusion, so it gets tricky. But when you say consciousness is what is it like to be something, you are implying that there's a perspective, that there's a subjective perspective. And so I think that anything that has a subjective perspective deserves to be called a self. And I'm going to explain what I think a self is after that. But before we get into the structure of the self, which I think it's an informational structure that emerges from recurrent feedback loops in the brain. So I think there's a very clear neural correlate to the self. And I wrote an article about this for the website called Noema. That's called "The Mind is More Than a Machine," and it's kind of a Hofstadter Gödelian argument about how the consciousness emerges from self-reference, specifically self-modeling. So I argue that consciousness emerges from a system that models the world and then models itself, and then that's when a point of view emerges and the light sort of comes on. Maybe it happens with single-celled organisms. I don't know, but that's what I believe, that it's with animal organisms with brains. But so I do believe it's emergent, but here's my point. I believe that it was preordained, and that's kind of a strong word, destiny. Ray Kurzweil uses that word, but I'll give a more scientific word, but it might be confusing. I would say determined, even though I believe there's indeterminism, such that we can have true agency and free will. There's a lot of indeterminism in the causal dynamics of reality, I will argue. That there's a global determinism, that these series of attractors emerges because there's this process of recursive self-organization or hierarchical emergence that creates life and consciousness. So your question is it emergent or intrinsic? I'm saying it emerges, but it was always going to. So it was fundamentally built into the nature of the cosmos, and in some ways it was its whole purpose.
Yeah, I use the term inherent because it sounded more euphonious, emergent versus inherent. So,
so I'm trying to say that it's both, that it's inherent in the dynamics, the evolutionary dynamics, but it comes up a little bit later. It's not there from the beginning, but it was always coming. It was inevitable. And so in that sense, I think and then when you realize that, then the actual intelligence of the fine-tuning in some sense becomes the sort of consciousness.
Right.
So then I'm probably aligned with Hoffman and Kastrup. I need to talk to them to fully find out. But so what I'm saying is that there's a kind of intelligence that I would call mind that's computational, but that the actual point of view, subjective experience, beings with that don't come until later. But maybe it's accurate to say that there is mind. I don't want to use the word consciousness because I've defined it as subjective experience, but that there is mind at the fabric of reality. So I don't know if I'm different than Hoffman or if we're just framing it differently.
When I was doing my experiments in the lab, I had a very lofty project where I said, well, okay, now if I remove, so here's the connectome. Now, if you remove the circuit that feeds, the circuit that mates, the circuit that moves, that does the locomotion, I left with a circuit that says, now I feed, now I mate, now I move. And I took out all of the circuits and I found nothing, right? So I then, even Dan Dennett sent me an index card that said eliminate the middle toad, right? So there's no place where everything comes together, and so I was at an emergent camp, and then I spoke to Hoffman, right, in an interview.
I think Dan Denn's wrong about that, by the way. I think there is a place where it all comes together, and that's what Adam Zaffron with integrated world modeling theory. These I can talk about that.
And then when I talked to Hoffman, I said, well, there is something wrong with my position. I think I mistook consciousness for the self, right? Or for the neural network that actually exists. That says now I feed, now I mate. So that sense of agent, that which provides a sense of agency, is different from the consciousness from which arises. And that's where I said, well, maybe consciousness is inherent, right? But the self or the selfing process is emergent, the sense of agency.
I like that.
Right. So that's a position that I
similar
took.
to my position. Yeah.
Yeah.
Except I do think that there are these neural attractors, like the global workspace theory talks about, a neural attractor, and I think that basically that there are these centralized workspaces that have these recurrent feedback loops, and that corresponds to the self. And I believe that when you take psychedelics, you can see this attractor dissolve and then reemerge.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to be looking more into the exact neural correlates of this thing that I'm calling the self. But Adam Zaffron has written about it. Bernard Bars has written some about it. And in some ways, adaptive resonance theory. So, yeah.
So you're biased more towards a global workspace theory rather than integrated information theory?
No, what I argue in this Noema article is that there's a neural attractor in the visual cortex that IIT and Koch basically argue that that's the neural correlate of consciousness. But what I and Adam Zaffron are arguing is that is phenomenal consciousness. So that's very basic, like what is it like subjective experience, and that global workspace theory, this more like frontal neural attractor, is what Ned Block calls access consciousness, which more relates to like the visual spatial sketch pad and like a workspace where you do
Right.
like you can transform stuff. So I think that's the higher mind. That's more of
Mm-hmm.
like, I guess, the self or the ego, and then when that dissolves, you just have the phenomenal consciousness, which is more, you feel more interconnected, and it's just raw experience. It's not really reflective or self-reflective. Yeah, I think we have to start not just talking about consciousness, but talking
Mm-hmm.
about phenomenal versus access consciousness.
Well, that actually reminds me that most of the studies that have interested me, aside from the oscillations of neural networks that produces a feeling of equanimity, for example, or and
Yes, when
all
you
of
like
those.
50
So
hertz, yeah,
yeah, and how do you maintain that via some psychoplastogens? So people will
that's very
experience what
cool.
it is. So but I've been working on in private because you cannot sell those kinds of things. But
I would love to see
the
those papers. Yeah.
yeah, the papers that I've been actually interested recently is something to do with what you just said. We have 65 billion neurons in the cerebellum, right? And a
Yep.
total of 86 billion. So we really have a very small amount in the gray matter. And how this 65 billion actually change our cognition significantly through the movement and just through the firing of the cerebellar neurons. And for me, that was more of if for me, it's like you suspect because there's a lot of neurons there and they're older evolutionarily, right? For it to have an effect on the way you see things. But when they are studying learning now and mental processing and what movements actually facilitate learning, it's been a fascinating um, uh, epistemic foraging for me to see how all of these older evolutionarily or the older structures actually contribute to the newer
Does it
portions.
affect cognition a lot? Because the reason
Yeah.
I was thinking, I thought you were going to go in a different direction. So
Mm.
Christoph Koch always makes that point that the cerebellum has most of the neurons, though it doesn't harbor any conscious entity. So, like, and it's because of the structure. Basically, it's not integrating information because it's all a
That's
feed
the new
forward.
finding, is that it actually has radiations to the cortex. That's the new finding.
That's
And I
awesome.
found it fascinating that they finally found the pathways from the cerebellum, not just to the motor cortex, but to other portions of the
Yeah, I would
somatosensory
imagine
cortex and
that it
other
would be
parts.
doing a lot of
Yeah,
modulation, but
yeah, and that's,
yeah,
for me, that's a fascinating find, right? Something that you just put on before, that's an old structure just for movement, etc. Suddenly you find that it's actually influencing uh, your your um, uh, your thought processes, right?
yeah.
The other uh, this is just on a side, the definition that I wanted to clarify really, because I use the term superorganism differently from a holobiont. Now, superorganism for me as a biologist is a slime mold where you have the same genetic material, but phenotypically they go through a cycle where there are, fruiting bodies, and then they go into, single cell stages and so on. But they maintain the same set of genes, and they look like different organisms. And when I have a nonprofit, health optimization medicine and practice, and I wrote the module there on clinical evolutionary medicine. And there I use the term, we are actually a holobiont, because, for Perlin Margulis, where, we have endosymbionts like the mitochondria, which are, of course, circular bacteria with a circular DNA inside our bodies. Uh, and and then we have exosymbionts, which are for example, the gut microbiota, which is like 2.2 kilos. It's a postnatal organ. It has a bidirectional communication with our brains, right? And don't ask me why I know this. I'm lecturing on this next month, but
Yeah, I was just talking about that the other day. Yeah,
yeah.
because yeah, it's
So
wild. I mean, that we
yeah,
didn't know
we're
about this stuff, like, a
yeah.
decade or two ago, and it's like, yeah,
Yeah, so I call ourselves a holobiont because we're an ecosystem of cells, right? So in fact, that's the basis for why I started health optimization medicine. It's like, why don't we take care of the fundamental cells that are in there? and the organs will
Yeah,
take
we
care
don't
of
think of
themselves.
ourselves as collectives. That's one
Yeah,
thing that I try to stress. Michael Levin also says this a lot, but like every system is a collective, you know?
right. Right, and people seem to get shocked that you are a collective, right?
Yeah.
But for me, it's also there's also the development of science and technology, right? Before we could only see through the heart, the brain, etc. But now we could actually see inside the cell.
Yeah.
So now that we can see in the cell, we could detect what's going on in the cell. Why the hell don't we take care of the cell from the inside, right? And then all the other layers that are above it that form organs will take care of themselves. And now the last definition that I wanted you to give was, what's the omega point?
Okay, this is good. So this kind of also relates to what you were just saying about a superorganism. So I guess, you know, this is kind of an abstract point to end on, but it's really it's a good segue into the theory that I'm going to be talking about
Yeah.
in the future. And part of that is called game theory of mind, which kind of
Mm.
combines game theory and theory of mind. But yeah, I won't go into that here, but I will say that it's a kind of a theory of language, or it explains some things about how we use language, and then kind of instructs us on like maybe how to use it differently. So by that I mean, when you okay, so there's this process of recursive self-organization. By that I mean things come together and make a group, and then that group becomes its own sort of single thing. So we just talked about, single-celled organisms. I think amoebas come together and form a slime mold. So you have this multicellular organism that acts as a single organism, um, but it's made of all these, previously individual organisms, and it can solve all these problems, like the traveling salesman problem. So
Mm.
it acts as an agent with a goal,
Hmm.
and we're multicellular organisms, and we think of ourselves as individual things, but as you said, we are networks of, the brain is 80 billion cells. I can't remember the body. It's like a trillion. It's something. It's over a trillion cells. It's some insane number. Um, and so then we form communities, and you can see like an ant colony, how the ant colony behaves as a single organism. You can also see videos of them like crossing streams by
Hmm.
making a bridge from their body, so they really look like this just or like larger organism like moving around. And you can look at ecosystems, and you can look at nations as acting like individual agents. And the theories that we have for consciousness, for living systems, like the free energy principle and IIT, these systems apply to collectives of humans, and
Hmm.
it shows that they have dynamics that act. When we're in groups, we act like single agents. Like
Hmm.
corporations are agents, countries are agents. So when you realize that there's this sort of relativity where all the things that we think of as single things are actually multiple things, then you start to see how you can call like many organisms working together a superorganism or a meta-organism. And people might have different reasons for using one over the other. Maybe they're like, well, if it's a superorganism and it's technically an organism, then it should be able to make copies of itself. It should be able to reproduce, and then that thing can evolve through Darwinian evolution if there's copies and they compete. But then you have the question of like, okay, let's say a city like Manhattan, let's say it gets really popular, and then someone wants to make another Manhattan on the world, on the other side of the world, and it becomes Tokyo. I have no idea how those cities, and what cities have actually been models for newer cities. But the point is that happens. That's a sort of reproduction. If we start to terraform Mars, and when we do it as the beings we are now, we're going to have to put plant life on Mars. We're going to have to create a biosphere. It's going to be like this biosphere replicating, except there's going to be variation because it's going to be a different planet with some different properties. So if these cultures compete, that's Darwinian evolution. So when you realize this sort of hierarchical structure to things where the same patterns getting repeated, then you don't get so hung up on debating for a century whether the biosphere is a superorganism or not. You just realize it's a complex adaptive system. It has these properties. Then you guys can decide, fight about definitions and figuring out what the term is. But the important thing is realizing that these patterns exist at these higher levels. They're like scale invariant. And so we do
So
need a
it's the
language of
patterns that are replicating then.
it's the patterns that are replicating in ways, but
yeah,
I feel like, that could be reductionist to say it's the patterns. Someone might go, well, it's the minds. It's the conscious minds that are really the important thing that replicate. So it's like, I don't even want to get into like a trap.
Let's go back. Because I've been thinking about this. I said, what's actually replicating? What's actually replicating is energy patterns, right? Because you require energy to stay out of equilibrium, right?
Yes. So that's accurate. But what if your picture of the universe is one where this whole process is to create conscious minds, agents that have experience the world? Then you might think, okay, that's a good low level like explanation. It's a good, physical explanation. But I think it's just as, legitimate to be like, well, what's being created are agents, like things that can experience the world, like minds.
Must an agent have a model of the world that it's in?
I think so. I think that's kind of what defines an agent. Maybe that's the best definition of life. Maybe I haven't heard that, but maybe life is like something that has a model of the world.
Because that's how I actually defined life.
That's
is
great.
That to have a model of the world, right?
That's simple. That might be the best I've heard.
Thank you.
Can we be co-creators of that? Can you give me
sure, absolutely. And for me, it's like even a simple, a cell, right?
Yes.
That moves away from a thermal gradient. It has a model of the world, right?
Yeah.
Or a food gradient. It has a model of the world. This is, of course, me being in the wet bench, counting how many times the C. elegans corkscrews, right? But that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. Was like it does have a model of the world. Like, for example, when I was counting, like 80% of the C. elegans worms would corkscrew to the right? And 20% would corkscrew to the left. And why is that? Right? So what's the model of the world for this one, and what's the model of the world for that one?
Yeah.
And that's how I got into this whole deep thinking about how do we define life? Is consciousness is biological life necessary for consciousness to occur? What is consciousness itself? How is it differentiated from the self? And these are depending on the times. You live at a time now where all of these things are freely discussed, and I love the arguments. I love the intelligent discussions around this. And thank you for your book, by the way, because when I looked at all of your reference, I can claim to have read almost all of the books that you cited. So I'm that old. That's what
Howard Bloom calls an omnologist. That's someone that knows about everything. Because I didn't read all those when I started it. Like, really half the stuff was like I found like during writing it. I was just
remember, I'm so much older than you are, Bobby. So I have had time to read those, and I had time to get in touch with them, during the time that it's getting written, because I am that old. But anyway, the synthesis that you made, is actually a brilliant synthesis of everything, as Carl Friston said in his remarks for your book, right? It's everything that I love. And I'm just going to be an also-ran here and say, hey, it's everything that I love. It's everything. It's all the bits and pieces that you print out, that you cut, and you put on the side.
Yeah, well, that's what I did. Like, I had some of it with me for like 15 years, like papers that I pulled out to write this. And I actually found an essay from 20 years ago as an undergrad, my English class, my evolution class, 2 essays that were pretty much this book, The Romance of Reality, 20 years ago in like 4-page essay form. But let me finish with that omega point question. I don't want to leave that. That's the biggest one.
Absolutely.
So the point is, with this kind of relativity, you see these patterns repeated at these different scales. Like what you call, a system or a meta system, it's arbitrary, because I might call you a system, and then I realize you're really a meta system because you're all these cells. But then you might be part of a collective, and then that collective is the meta system. So we just have to, it's kind of like physics, where you have to kind of create, state a frame of reference first, and then you can start talking. But everything's going to always be inaccurate, because you're really not a system, you're a collective, but you're also a system, and you're also part of a collective. So yeah, we just have to embrace that and then talk in a more careful way. So the same thing is with an omega point. So an omega point, a French philosopher, he was religious, but he was also going against the church because he had this evolutionary theory. He was after Darwin, but he saw this progress in the theory. And Darwin actually was a teleologist too, when the first edition of the book. And so Teilhard de Chardin saw this leading to basically humans forming one collective conscious mind that he called the noosphere. Mm-hmm. And then he thought that was approaching this point of maximal complexity and information integration. So where all of our minds kind of become this greater thing that he kind of thought of as sort of a God, like an emergent God. Right. And that this is like kind of maybe like a Jesus type state, but right. This is what everything has been building towards. And he called it an omega point. And he saw it as a sort of cosmic unification, but I don't think he could fathom us like spreading through space. But in the 1980 or so, there was a book called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle by Barrow and Tipler. And actually, John Wheeler wrote the foreword for it. He was like part of making this book get written. But it said that life is, the laws and constants are fine-tuned such that life is going to spread and transform the whole universe into this conscious mind. Well, it was based on a closed model of the universe where there's a big crunch. So that's not really important, though. You could have a similar omega point with an open universe model. And Ray Kurzweil really thinks that, the universe, he has diagrams in his book, The Singularity is Near, that where life spreads and then the universe wakes up. So that might be kind of hard to understand, but imagine that just understand that life used to be a single cell on this planet, and now it covers the full planet. And it seems to be that there's this collective intelligence that we call humanity. So imagine again that our brains are networks of 80 billion cells exchanging like binary signals. So why wouldn't a collective of humans also have consciousness? And so if you can have a global consciousness on the planet, if life spreads throughout the entire universe and is informationally connected, it would be an information networks that would lead to something like a universal conscious mind. So some people believe that the evolutionary process is building God, essentially. And I think that's a good hypothesis, because God is just any agents that have cognitive power and, power to create simulated worlds, whatever, technology that we can't comprehend. That's what the definition of a God is. Just something
so that makes us demigods, right?
It does.
You mentioned Teilhard de Chardin, and I grew up, unfortunately or fortunately, Catholic, educated in a Catholic private school, where I was told by this nun that the work of Teilhard de Chardin was odious. All right.
Yeah.
And so when she said that the work of Teilhard de Chardin was odious, I started reading his work. So
wow. At least you knew who he was. That's awesome. That's funny.
Because
he gets such a bad rap. Scientists hate him because he's too religious, but then the religious people hate him. He's like, he doesn't get any love.
Well, there's also my mom was quite a religious woman, and she made me read this book by Bishop Trine or something, and then it said something there that reminded me of the things that you were saying, both in the book and in the public media, and it said something like the purpose the purpose of everything is lifeward, right? So everything goes lifeward. And I said,
That's
well,
great. Can you send me that reference? I would, yeah,
yeah,
I love that.
it's called it's by Bishop Trine, Trine. I don't remember the title of the book, but
Hmm.
everything goes lifeward. And of course, me as a reductionist scientist before, I said, that's not necessarily true. What's the role of stochasticity in this whole process? And so on and so forth. But
Well,
it
that's the
was.
thing. It's there's a fundamental stochasticity to nature, but then there's this globally determined patterns that do emerge out of that uncertainty, and that's what's beautiful. Um, but I do think there's a lot. There's probably this new theory. I won't say it's mine. This theory of like recursive emergence, you could call it.
Mhm.
I think it has more in common with religion than the reductionist picture, and I think that's fine. I think
Well,
that's
we
awesome.
can form a cult, Bobby.
Yes. Well, so I will plug my Road to Omega Substack. So it's a project. It's a
Sure.
plan to save the world with science, epistemology, and blockchain technology. And the people who follow this, we call ourselves
Mhm.
the Neuromantics, spelled Neuro, Neuromantics, and
Neuromantics,
we are the anti-cult
like
cult.
neuromancers.
Exactly. So it's kind of influenced by that. But actually, William Gibson's book Neuromancer was influenced by a 1978 album called Neuromantic by the Japanese experimental musician Yukihiro Takahashi, who was
Mhm.
the member of this band Yellow Magic Orchestra. But yeah, so Neuromantics, we think that's a catchy name, and we're about to put out a lot of interesting content. So it's free to follow the Substack. There are paid subscriptions for extra content, but we're the anti-cult cult. We have the cosmic religion, which is a religion that's not a religion. John Vervaeke also talks about the
You better
importance of
start a
having.
nonprofit for that so you could rake in the donations, right?
Yeah, we might do that, but I want to be for profit because I need to pay the bills too to make this project happen.
No,
Um,
non-profits so you're tax free, and
Yeah, but that
then you
seems a
could pay
little.
yourself out of there,
That seems a little unethical.
right?
Maybe we'll do that. But yeah, we're a cult of radical Bayesians.
Hmm.
So we are radical in our ability to be rational. So yeah, if you want to check that out, follow that. There's all this content try to be made more accessible because the book's written for people like you, Ted, but you're not normal. You are a genius,
Abnormal.
and you're abnormal, but you're still way too smart. And people like me need a more accessible version. So I'm trying to take all the stuff in the book and make it super fun and easy to understand. So yeah,
Yeah.
I would love
Yes.
to interview you for the Road to
Yeah,
Omega channel
I'd be
too.
happy to, Bobby. But I'm learning a lot from you because you're actually the one who did this synthesis. And the book of Bobby, by the way, is called Romance of Reality. And the way for uh, a person who wishes to understand the book fully is to take a look at the infinity map. And while you're reading the book, so you could get oriented as to what he's talking about. Someone like me, even if I don't need an infinity map, that infinity map actually helped me a lot in terms of
Okay,
where to
great.
place
Yeah,
my
it's
my
still a
thoughts.
little complex, but yeah, we're gonna make a lot of infinity maps and put those in like new posts. Yeah, that's a concept mapping software that one of the new romantics, Oliver Wan, helps me with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I look at all the names in the references in the. It's like I know the works of this, and in all of those, like I've read works of these people,
Yeah,
and
it's
it
kind of
was
showing
fun.
off. Yeah,
Y-
no, it is a good. It tells people. Yeah, because there's so much amazing literature there that
yeah.
people don't know about at all. So my book is not really, it's my synthesis, but none of it is like my idea. It's all just reference. It's all just summarizing past work and showing how this
Hmm.
theory emerges from all the other people's work. Yeah. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of like a journalist. I take like a journalist approach, sort of, in the book.
So let's since you're the one who's into simplifying these things, so let's break down your synthesis into just three things, and I'll so that it's easier for our listeners to understand or our viewers to understand. Now, I was actually, I have a little story here. It was in, the book was published in '06, but I was flying from, I think, Barcelona to Gran Canaria for a vacation in 2007 when I was reading Into the Cool by,
Schneider and
Yeah, and
Dorian
Schneider and
Sagan.
Sagan, right?
Yeah.
And I said, well, it was there that struck me. It's like, you mean the life on Earth is just the thin coverlet of life on Earth is just its mechanism to actually draw heat away from itself, and and that actually floored me. It unnerved me for my entire vacation. So,
Well, if you read that, like in that book, they also question it because they also are like there could be a teleological cosmic thing. Like I don't think it's funny because I saw the same thing, but I didn't take it the same way. And Jeremy England didn't either because he's Jewish and his book is kind of, it has all these biblical passages and from the Torah in his
yeah,
book on this, like every life is on fire. But for me, what I saw is that life is inevitable. It's built into the design of the universe. And yes, it does this dissipative thing, but to me, that theory just says that life is part of nature. It's inevitable. It doesn't, to me, say that it's only here to draw out, to produce heat. So
this is the first, by the way, just to organize this for people who are viewing or listening to us. This is the first part of the synthesis I was talking about, which is about thermodynamic equilibrium, but it's equilibrium, second law of thermodynamics, but it's thermodynamics is far from equilibrium, and in order to maintain that, you need to feed energy. And I was discussing this in '07 with my mentor then, and he basically said, Ted, you have to dissipate this heat from the sun, and what's going to happen is you're going to make more and more complex structures, right? And they get more efficient at the energy dissipative process, and that's where the whole I actually memorized your synthesis in the acronym TIE. And the one is thermodynamics, the second one is information, and the third is evolutionary theory. It's TIE.
yeah,
That's how I tie up your synthesis.
yeah, that
So,
yeah, that's
so,
nice.
so,
Yeah, those
so
three things become the new evolutionary synthesis. Yeah, the integrated
yes.
evolutionary synthesis. Yeah,
So can you
I
just
might throw
inform
cybernetics
us?
in there though.
Can you inform us, how thermodynamics works uh, far from equilibrium?
Yeah, so it gets some people might be listening to this and find it a little bit confusing because equilibrium, when ecologists use that term, they're talking about a kind of ordered state, like a dynamic, steady state. So you can have an equilibrium like a society is like in an equilibrium, but the way equilibrium was traditionally used in thermodynamics was to mean, for example, if you have, let's say, a sink full of water and then some of it's cold and then you pour some hot water and then there's like a hot little spot. So if you give it enough time, that system will come to equilibrium and all of the hot water will spread and dissipate throughout the system, and it will be one uniform temperature. It won't be just hot, one space and then cold in the other. So equilibrium is just when things have relaxed to a state of stasis. And so
Hmm.
that's death. So like a living thing, if it stops eating food, it stops getting energy and it dies, it just slowly starts to deteriorate, and then all, its molecular structure breaks down and then it just kind of gradually like fades away. So to maintain an organized state, a state that's far from thermodynamic equilibrium, a system must be feeding on energy from the environment. And then so it's this informational system. It's feeding on energy, and it's like as it feeds on energy, it's this kind of cycling system. Like a living system is kind of, it's not like a static object. It's like a dynamic process. All these cells, doing all of these things, communicating, signaling each other. And so for all that to be working, it has to have constant energy. But the way I see it is not as like life as this process of, it has to dissipate this energy, in the form of heat. What I see it is that the universe has all of this energy that's free energy, that's energy ready to do work, and it flows through matter, and then it starts to structure matter into life, and then it just keeps like, like creating copies, and then the structure gets more and more elaborate. So the way Harold Morowitz talked about like a fourth law, he was like, this law of like the energy that moves through us, flows through a system, organizes that system. And so that's how I see this story of the second law, this tendency towards life. It's not that just life is providing a mechanism for, dissipating that energy. I think what the story is that energy starts flowing through matter and then creating ever more elaborate structures. And these structures, the more complex they become, the more energy they consume. So there is this story of increasing entropy in the form of heat, but there's not a story of increasing disorder. It's just order can keep growing, and it's seeming like there's no limit to the energy supply. There's dark energy always being created. You can see it. Sean Carroll has a blog that says energy is not conserved. At the
And
beginning,
and that pathway is inherent, you think?
Yes, with cosmic conflation theory, even at the beginning of the universe, there was energy being created, matter and energy being created for a pretty long time. And now they just say, they talk about energy completely differently. There's all this positive energy being created, and they say there's like negative energy is the energy that corresponds to the gravitational force that corresponds to the new mass and energy that's being created. But you can use that energy, like that it's free energy seems to be being created. Like it's not. And so I wrote an article called "Life Need Not Ever End" for Noema, and David Deutsch shared it, and then Sabine Hossenfelder commented that she had made a similar argument in her book. So it seems like the heat death hypothesis may be going out the window, and that maybe complexity can grow forever, and maybe there's no limits to life. Yeah. It's an exciting time in science. Yeah.
Well, it's actually interesting because I deal with this on a very molecular level, right? And the initial the studies now on coacervate droplets that are forming, and then for the origins of life kinds of studies. And I was actually fascinated because, for example, in the mitochondria, if you take a look at the origins, it was actually dissipating a gradient, a proton gradient that was formed naturally, and that what we did over time was actually automate the process. We now have the electron transport chain, actually, where everyone in biochemistry is just focused on the electron transport chain. I said, no, guys, take a look at the proton gradient. That's what's getting dissipated in order to produce energy, right? To produce the ATP in the body. And that's my lifelong love affair with gradients, right? It's like it was natural before, right? It was but then over time in evolution, we actually basically automated the process. We made it from a passive to an active process.
Well, and when I'm saying that there's no energy limits, that's my point. We never run out of gradients. And so basically, and Alan Guth says the universe is the ultimate free lunch. He makes that statement. So yeah, it's great that we have gradients. That's how nature gets its energy. I guess I'm just saying that when it's dissipating energy, you can look at that same process as saying that thing is consuming a lot of energy. It's just using a lot of energy, and it's using it up. But my point is, when you see energy being dissipated, that means you've got a complex structure doing some like information processing.
Right. Which is the second part of what I wanted to discuss to you about, is the information theory and how it is tied up to the synthesis, right? To the unifying theory that you have.
So I think what evolution is, Darwinian evolution, is so when something is adapting, and basically it's an organism, it's like a species of organisms, and that organism is basically has a survival problem, as all of these this list of problems, things that it must do to survive, which gives it goals.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's evolving, when these things are making copies of themselves and there's these random mutations, they're basically exploring a space of possible designs, organism designs. And
you're sounding like Levin, huh?
yeah, but I didn't know Levin was
More
talking
for
about.
space.
I didn't even know. I wrote this stuff in chapter 6, and I just sent it to Levin because I just presented with 2 co-presenters day before yesterday to his lab. So we're discussing this stuff now, and I just put in my attached my book, but because this stuff relates to Gödel's theorems in a really interesting way. But we'll have to talk about that maybe in the future if we have another discussion. But he's thinking about it in the right way. So
we'll talk about it over reverse osmosis water. How's that?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Remineralized reverse osmosis water. How's that?
I can't wait to try all the things you have. Yeah, all the magic potions. So an organism, when it's evolving, it's exploring a design space and it's looking for solutions to survival problems, and we call those adaptations. So it's basically learning. It's like a search problem. It's like a trial and error, kind of like a genetic algorithm. How that works. I mean, it's exactly how those work, like evolutionary algorithms in AI. So you can think of organisms as embodied theories about how to survive in the world. And so each of these adaptations corresponds to genes and a structure, a larger, dynamical, organization that also encodes information. So it's not just in the genes, it's in the dynamics. So you can like model these things, and you can have all these different parts and connections. And so an evolving system is a system that's learning. It's learning about the world. It's acquiring knowledge. So you can see those genes is sort of like analogous to beliefs. They're kind of like they code for and beliefs in the brain, are like basically memes. And so you have, genes and memes are analogous. They just encode information. So you can think about
they encode Bayesian priors, right?
Yes, so it's a process of Bayesian inference. So you're encoding knowledge about the world, and then organisms are trying to predict the world based on the knowledge that they've acquired in the past. And then when they're wrong, they should update their model. And so it's a Bayesian inference process, and it's a process of life as accumulated knowledge. It's just like embodied knowledge, and life is solving these survival problems always. And then the thermodynamic story becomes kind of secondary. It's just saying, to do all of this process, you need energy, and you're dissipating energy, and you're feeding on gradients. But it's really more about the knowledge creation than it is about the heat creation. The heat creation is just a byproduct.
You need to be able to preserve that in order to navigate the next world that you're in, right?
Yes.
So
you have to preserve that structure and that knowledge. Structure.
And that's the reason for, I was actually, I don't remember whether or not you mentioned epigenetics in that book, right? Because
I think I mentioned it a little bit, because I do say it's like Lamarck's revenge. Like everyone was like, oh,
for me,
the idea of inherited.
You can
traits.
lump the information into both genetic and epigenetic changes, right? Epigenetic changes are not in the genes themselves, but in the epigenome, right? But that still is an encoding information.
Yes.
It is still heritable, right?
I think it plays a way bigger role than we realize too.
I again, we in the Home Hope in the Health Optimization Medicine Academy, we have an entire module on epigenetics, and it just for me, just having to review that module before it gets posted to students, it just gives you all of these ideas again, because I always view the world with an evolutionary lens. As I was about to write a book before, my second book, and but the publisher said, I said that my audience is doctors, and she said doctors don't read,
Ah,
um, and I shelved it.
unfortunately, that's probably more true than
Is
not. Yeah.
shelved it, but in it was actually something that you mentioned in your lectures, which reminded me of when I was writing about disease causation. Right, of course, Buddhism has dependent origination, but when writing about theory of medicine, you write about disease causation. So the first time that disease causation was magical, right? You peed on a mound that was the house of a dwarf, and now you have UTI, right? That's the magical version, right? And then there's the religious version, right? So the person is possessed. That's why he's having all of these seizures, right? He's possessed by the devil. So they would trepine the head to let the demon out, right? So you can see holes in the skulls, right? And
So
then
scary. Yeah.
yeah, and then came the empirical phase, right? The empirical phase, which is like, okay, you give an antibiotic, then you kill the bacteria, or you do this surgery and then you remove the tumor. That's the empirical phase. And then we went to the rational phase. Well, if you have the following lifestyle factors, chances are you get a heart attack by X, right? That's statistical. So right now we're the empirical rational mode of medicine, but I think we have to go now to the evolutionary mode of medicine, which
Yes.
is which we have to answer the question, like, you know two questions: how do we get sick, right? What makes us have the propensity to get sick, and how do we get healthy? And answering that in terms of the way the body actually anneals itself. You use that
Yes.
term
I love the Neil. Yeah,
because
I love
the
that term.
body heals itself, right? So over evolution, it has accumulated a lot of annealing mechanisms, really. And
I
do
do
you
think they're kneeling it. Yes, that's really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, before this conversation we were discussing about pain. One of the questions we ask in evolutionary medicine is really, uh, how much of the pain should we actually inhibit via,
Yes, because it's telling us
like,
something
yeah,
informative, right?
right?
Like you don't want to
And what it
inhibit too
does,
much.
as
Yeah.
you point out in your book, it actually influences behavior. Say you sprained your ankle, right? The pain forces you sit down and to remove the weight from your
Yeah.
ankle, right? It also swells. It's like a cast, right? So the question now is, how much should we interfere with these natural annealing
Yeah,
mechanisms,
it's
right?
feedback. And if you didn't
Yeah,
have that feedback, you would
right.
damage your body because you would just push it too hard. You would just try to do things that you shouldn't do.
Right. And annealing is part of what's preserved in that
Yeah.
information. What should the organism do when this particular thing happens? And I think that's from magical, religious, empirical, rational, and evolutionary. And I think I'm seeing the next session now, the next epoch now, as after evolutionary would be energetic, right? It's like these energy patterns that are
I think
actually
we have to
flowing in space.
combine it like energetic informational, like make it one term but
Yeah,
include informational.
that's true. Energetic, informational.
Or
So
maybe
thank
even
you.
cybernetic. The reason I like
Yes.
cybernetics because it's all about loops. It's all about feedback and updating and like
Yes,
so.
that was actually my fourth question here, is why you would actually include cybernetics. But let's get into evolutionary theory first, right? And how it ties to your unifying theory, the
Okay, I do have to
BVSR.
run it at
Yeah.
5, but
Yes, sir.
I'm having a lot of fun, so I can probably go a little bit over. Um, so how? Sorry, repeat that once more.
So, how does evolutionary theory figure into the unifying theory, the BVSR, blind variation,
Yeah.
selective retention?
So, yeah, that mechanism you mentioned. So we normally think of Darwinian evolution as, survival of the fittest and competition, but in the book I argue that self-organization is just as important of a part of evolution. And so that's when things come together rather than
Mm,
compete. They form a collective, and so the systems come together and form what some call a meta system.
mm-hmm,
So when we form society, it's still kind of what Darwinian evolution of the standard type is doing, but instead of searching for these adaptations, we say, we just said that organisms are kind of searching a problem space or a
mm-hmm.
design space for solutions to this survival problem. So they're kind of, the biosphere is kind of searching for adaptations. It's like life is trying to find the most optimal form for these different niches. Um, so the evolutionary model includes competition and cooperation, and it's the cooperation that forms these new levels in the hierarchy. So it's only, when you have a species and they're competing, it is optimizing the individual organisms, because when they compete, only the fittest survive. So the optimal designs get encoded into the population, but you're just playing what's called a zero-sum game.
Right.
And if you learn that you can come together and that you can actually meet your energy demands with less work if you come together, so there's a thermodynamic benefit to coming together, you can form a larger system, you can form a larger agent, a meta agent. And so we have to realize that and come together. For example, as a nation right now, we're being pulled apart by this polarization process, and it's creating instability, and there's going to be a bifurcation point coming up. So it's like, do we collapse, or do we take this idea of being able to find a synergistic collective configuration? And so I think it's, usually it happens without organisms even consciously realizing it. You kind of just, by accident find these little relationships that are beneficial. But I think we now need to do it at the national and global level. So yeah, this evolutionary theory of the book, it's very practical. It says that, we are going to accomplish our goals. We're going to need to be able to extract more and more energy from the universe, because that's the problem. We're running out of energy. We can't. Fossil fuels is also creating all these externalities, like climate change, stuff like that. So we need to solve the energy problem, but we also need to do it in a way where, like, we care for all of the agents. So like, we just can't keep using energy at the same level right now, because it's hurting us. So there's no one single way to look at it. It's just this global optimization problem, and you want to try to do the best, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But that's very vague. So basically,
and very anthropocentric, right?
I wouldn't say so, because what this theory does is show you that the biosphere is part of us. We're part of one larger organism. And so then the biosphere becomes part of your body too. So you want to just do good for the whole biosphere. But you want to prioritize based on minimizing suffering. So you're not going to want to make everyone become vegan overnight, or because they're not going to do it, and then they're just going to eat all meat. So you would say, let's start with octopus and squid. They seem super intelligent. Cows, and like go in that order, and like let everybody eat shrimp. Say go crazy with the shrimp for now.
and you are what you eat, so everybody will be shrimping. I'm kidding. But Bobby, there was a book that was self-published by a guy named D.B. Kelly in 2013, and it was entitled "The Origin of Phenomena." I was looking at it from your references, and he's not cited there, but I don't know him, but when I read his book, it was fascinating. That was where I read about the survival of the most stable, for example, and then instead of survival of the fittest, he said the survival of the most stable, and then he said it's competition, it's cooperation, competition, and compromise, and that was what he was saying in the book, and I use his book a lot as a reference in the evolutionary medicine module.
I'll have to check it out. It's familiar, but
it's actually quite fantastic. So last two questions. I know you have to run. The one question is, why do you think cybernetics should be included in the thermodynamics, information theory, and evolutionary theory and cybernetics? And the last will be, what are the three pieces of advice you could give to our audience as to how to live smarter, not harder?
Awesome. Okay, I'll try to do that. That's a bit of a challenge. I think cybernetics is the most important out of all of them. And Carl Friston's free energy principle is really based on cybernetics, because cybernetics Ross Ashby was one of the main people who kind of forged out the field. Norbert Wiener was really the inventor, but I think Ross Ashby did the most interesting work. So he came up with the principle of self-organization, the good regulator theorem. Basically, it says that any system that has to regulate another system has to have a model of that system. And so any biological organism that has to exist in an environment has to have a model of that environment, or if it has to, survive by dodging other agents or fighting them or something, it has to have a model of those agents. And so first instance free energy principle is basically saying that, to stay out of thermodynamic equilibrium, agents must have a, model the world, and then they must, they should update this model in a Bayesian manner. But yeah, first instance, neuroscience theory, which is really trendy right now, is definitely rooted in cybernetics. But so cybernetics talks about systems, like modeling systems, and also talked about like systems, recursive systems that, update and adapt and learn. So, or, biological systems are cybernetic systems. But,
and you're talking about neural networks now, right? So, right?
I would say
feed forward systems, feed forward, feedback, recurrent neural nets.
They're cybernetic systems for sure, and that's in that book, the Valentin Turchin's book that I mentioned. You can see that his cybernetic models are very much like the neural nets of today. Cybernetics systems, and they have the mathematics. They try to lay out the mathematics of feedback and recursion. So I think, so adaptive systems that learn, they're all using feedback and recursion. And so, check out the free energy principle if you haven't heard of it.
Well, I interviewed Carl Friston.
Yeah, I was just talking about to your audience, but
okay.
I know you know all about it.
No.
I listened to the first half of that. Yeah, that was great. I was enjoying that. So, and then the last question, the three. What is it again?
The three pieces of advice that you would give to our audience on how to live life smarter, not harder. Like your advice, and I'd like to couch this as like the one advice I'd like to give is like, I know you're not a Hitchens fan, and Christopher Hitchens fan, and saying, how do you make the science and spirituality compatible with each other, or they would never meet paths? That kind of advice where you'd see how the audience would actually say, well, okay, Hitchens says this, and he's saying this.
Hitchens has there's a video, I'm going to post it. It's of Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens individually basically saying that they believe that potentially that a God exists. And I gotta find. I think I lost I gotta find them again. But Hitchens,
we're okay with that, right? As long as we're demigods.
So. Yes, we're demigods. Well, that's what. So Dawkins basically said, I could be persuaded that some mathematical genius created the universe, and he said the God of the physicists, the God of Paul Davies, you could make a good argument for that. And then Dennett was being asked on the Closer to Truth channel, which is great, about if there could be a creator. And Dennett says, well, maybe, but I don't think it's an interesting question. Of course it's an interesting question, and of course it's really huge. You said maybe. So here's my thing. When I understood that we could create digital conscious agents, well, let me not make it about me. If you're taking a Bayesian approach, and an empirical approach, and we come to a time where we start to create simulations that are agents, let's say they're conscious agents, we haven't done that yet, but let's say we can do that. At that moment, then, because prior to the computer, if someone's like, could this universe be created? You would be like, no, there's no scientific theory for that, because there's no mechanism for that, right? But once we do it ourselves, suddenly that must be added to the possible theories of the creation of our universe. If we create a universe in our universe, we have to ask, is our universe such a creation? Because then you get into this relative thing where you don't know how, the stack, like how far it goes. Like our universe could be the creation if we're doing the same thing. Of course it can be. I mean, that's what makes it so. A Bayesian approach would add that. As soon as we do it, you add that to the list of possible theories. Maybe you don't give it a high weighting, but you got to put it there and you got to give it some non-zero weighting. And so I think now that it's probably more likely that our universe isn't the first. It's nested in a series. And if that's the case, then it's not even like a supernatural thing. It's just an agent that's far more powerful than us. Relative to us, it's a god. But that agent might be clueless about where it came from. It might be creating us, our universe, to answer the question of where they came from, the same way we want to ask our AI. Like if we get AGI, like, is there a God? Like we want to ask it.
It's like an infinite regress.
Well, so yeah, you always have the infinite regress problem. What I'm saying is maybe that's not a problem. Maybe
or turtles all the way down, according to Sturgeon Simpson.
I'm not saying, so my only point is, so it doesn't handle the infinite regress problem. But what it does say is we're epistemically, we shouldn't be confined to believing in just this universe. Why? Because the fine-tuning problem is a very difficult problem. And the multiverse answer, I'm not even going to go into that now, but the typical answer for that, I don't think it holds up. So I think it's more likely that this universe has another, is a baby universe and has a parent universe, and maybe a whole series. And you can see that evolutionary refinement of the constants. And that's what Lee Smolin's cosmological natural selection video theory argues in a way. But so in that, there's no God. But what I'm saying is, if you have this process of universes leading to other universes, they've led to us, we're creating virtual universes. So there's probably a whole nested chain, and this progress will lead to gods. It will lead to agents that create new agents. So there's no reason to think that we're not a product of an agent, of an intelligent agent, if this process continues as the way it seems, because we're creating them. But yeah, so
knowing that, how do we live our lives better?
Okay, so what does all this mean?
Yeah.
I think that reality is fundamentally purposeful. I think we live in a purposeful existence, meaning I don't think all possibilities are realized. I think there's this evolutionary process that realizes, basically, you see these stable states and you see this process of recursive self-organization and hierarchical emergence. So I think that reality has these two qualities. It's going to always be in dynamic tension between like problems and solutions. And so we're never going to reach a utopia, but things just are going to keep getting better. But then there's going to be like chaotic points. So there's phase transitions just all the way up. And so if that's true, so I have a post, it's very practical. This is sounds very abstract, but there's a kind of what I would call a self-help system that I've tried to design.
Yeah, right.
Called the teleological stance. And it says that you're an agent with a goal, and that goal is your individual goal of whatever makes you happy in life and, productive. But that should be nested within the collective goal of facilitating the continual, persistence and progress of life. And
so
if your
in other words,
align,
you want to wake up the cosmos.
I want to wake up the cosmos. I want to wake up the collective human mind.
That's my personal motto, democratize enlightenment. So
yes, and I think Sean Carroll's coming out with a book called Democracy, which is interesting. But yeah, so I think that we need to, as a collective, start, and as individuals, we need to have a mental phase transition where we realize we're part of this larger system and that we have agency and we can make a change. So we have free will. We can actually create these butterfly effect type processes where we can come up with an idea, and if we are clever about how to make it go viral, we can enact change very quickly. So I think we need to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing, so that's practical. We need to kind of like take this stance where we're looking for solutions to problems. and we're kind of getting in that mindset and spreading that mindset. The second
Yeah,
thing is more about the
like
spiritual.
put LSD in the water, right?
Well, that would be a quick way to do it, yeah. And that kind of leads to the second thing. We don't. I do mention something like that in the book at the end, but the second thing would be embracing spirituality. Doesn't need to be this isolation between religion and science. I think if this story that I've described is true, then there's a very spiritual aspect to the world. And if you're into Donald Hoffman, you think that consciousness is kind of pervasive and like whatever, like all of that. This theory is not one thing. Like all of these things are just kind of different perspectives on this same purposeful story. And so I think we should embrace spirituality. I think rituals, all that stuff, there's lots of adaptive characteristics. Like that's the reason that those things got encoded in human society is because they're good. Like, so, setting goals, even prayer, it's kind of like you're using theory of mind. Like when you're praying for people, like you're building compassion. When you're doing rituals, like I have like candles. I don't know where they went. I like light candles and like put on like mood lighting and like certain like ambient music when I'm like trying to write like articles or about this. And so I think we should embrace that. The third thing I would say, have fun. Like you're not gonna, if you want to spread this, like the way Road to Omega, like what we're trying to do, we're not trying to like beat people over the heads with it. Like I'm right. This is the theory of everything. Like we think we can spread it with like pop culture memes and jokes and like playlist challenges where people are exchanging playlists that have certain like messages or whatever. So like, how can we make this like movement, this awakening, collective awakening that we want to see people do? How can we make it like fun and cool and not some like lame, like, all right, people are going to blow it off because it's like woo woo or whatever. Like, how do we make this fun? How do we make it like people got into Game of Thrones and Stranger Things? How can we make what we're trying to do with psychedelics and like expanded consciousness? How can we make that part of the cultural zeitgeist?
Yeah, yeah. My last comment here is like, why is it just teleological? Why not a teleological and semantic self-help, right? Because it's purpose and meaning, and
That's
it's
perfect. That's
essentially
better. Teleosemantic. Yeah.
teleosemantic, right? So you have that, and I've been waiting for you to say that. Where's this meaning happen here? But I said, well, I'm just going to suggest it towards the end. Bobby, thank you so much. I know we've extended like 10 minutes over our allotted period, but this has been a most enjoyable conversation. We're neighbors. I hope to meet you in person fairly soon. I know we both travel widely, and so we get a good time during our downtime, probably during the holidays or so. Well,
I'm traveling in Halloween in November to London and Barcelona, but I will probably see you before that. Maybe if you want to have lunch in a month, that'd be great.
Yeah. That would be perfect. That would be perfect. Thanks, Bobby, and
Awesome.
thank you for your book, guys. I actually encourage you to read the book. It is eminently readable, and if you're like me, who's uh, both auditory and visual, and sometimes I buy a book just for the diagrams. Then you could actually supplement it with an infinity map and take a look at what is up to in terms of the discussion, and you could follow it very, very closely. And you can actually not just intellectualize it, but the whole thing is to get a feel, right? It's a difference between information and knowledge. And for me, my definition of information is just it's organized data, right? Well, trust me, I'm someone who studied medical informatics, right? But knowledge is personalized information, and by doing this, you will begin to know. And there's a certain feeling state that goes with knowing, right? Which you could use for good or ill, like I know what you did last summer. So, so thank you again, Bobby.
Thanks,
and I hope to meet you soon.
Yeah, you too. This was really fun. Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye. Bobby and I have discussed the possibility that the universe may be one large neural network. We also defined what is life, what is consciousness, what is a self, what is attention. We also discussed the integrated evolutionary synthesis. that uses concepts and examples from thermodynamics, information theory, evolutionary theory, and cybernetics to explain the progression from inanimate matter to life to mind as a lawful progression in cosmic evolution driven by knowledge acquisition. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Thank you.